the Indus Valley Civilization. To do so, we need to first understand the world at this time. And this is about 2500 to 2000 BC, okay? This is what we call the Middle Bronze Age, because most people were using bronze for weapons, for tools. So over here is Egypt. And as we discussed, by far, Egypt is the wealthiest, most advanced civilization in the Bronze Age. Over here, across the Red Sea, is Arabia. Okay? And even though Arabia isn't really discussed that much in world history, it's still significant because it's part of the trading network. Okay? So the Arabia, it's many nomads who take goods from Mesopotamia over to Egypt and then into the Mediterranean, which accesses all of Europe. This is Sumer, which is the beginning of the Mesopotamian civilization. Okay? Up here is Anatolia, the Levant. And then the Indus Valley Civilization is over here. And today, it would cover the countries of Afghanistan, Pakistan, and northwest India. Okay? What makes Indus Valley Civilization important is it's really by the coast, which allows it to access Mesopotamia and Egypt. Okay? Meaning, during the Bronze Age, these three civilizations, Egyptians, Mesopotamians, and the Indus Valley Civilization, were heavily interconnected through trade. And the Indus Valley Civilization, what was unique to them are certain products, for example, indigo dye, which was really sought after in Mesopotamia and in Egypt. Their handicrafts, their jewelry were also very famous throughout the world. They usually traded with Sumer and Egypt by trading with the Gulf state nations of Bahrain and Oman and Dubai. Okay? And they actually had a colony by the Persian Gulf. Right? This civilization was so good at trading that we believe they even traded with China, okay? Which is pretty far away, but their ships were huge and they were very good navigators. As the Bronze Age developed over time, bronze was in heavy demand, and the main components of bronze are copper and tin. Tin is mainly found in the mountains of Afghanistan over here, okay? Which meant the Indus Valley Civilization started to now expand over to Afghanistan in order to access the tin trade. Okay? So tin was really sought after, but there was also another stone called lapis lazuli, which is really sought after by the Egyptians for its like spiritual and aesthetic qualities. Okay? And over here, because of the trade with Afghanistan, land routes start to develop into Anatolia and Mesopotamia. Okay? And as well, because of this trade in Afghanistan, new civilizations start to develop as well. And they're not as advanced, as large as the three major ones, but they're still pretty advanced. So for example, up here is what we call the Oxus Valley Civilization. The technical term used by archaeologists are the Bactrian Margiana Archaeological Complex. You don't have to know this, okay? It's called BMAC. What makes this civilization important is it interacts with the steppes people, okay? Called the Androano culture. So as you can see, the Indus Valley Civilization, through its partners, the Oxus Valley Civilization, and its colonies over here, now trade with the entire world. There's no piece of the Western world the Indus Valley Civilization does not touch. Okay? Does that make sense? So this is a world about 2500 to 2000 BCE. It's a world that's heavily interconnected. And there are two major sources of demand. The Egyptians are extremely wealthy, and they want these valuable jewelry and handicrafts for their burials. Okay? That's one source of heavy demand. The main source of demand is actually Mesopotamia, where the city-states of Sumer are fighting wars against each other. And in wars, bronze makes a huge difference because bronze armor is much more stronger than copper armor. Okay? So these two places are driving demand, and as such, the Indus Valley Civilization is growing wealthy through trade. Okay? Does that make sense? Any questions so far before I continue? Okay, so even though the Indus Valley Civilization is connected with Egypt and Mesopotamia, it's a radically different civilization. Okay? So the first thing that makes Indus Valley Civilization interesting is it's a huge area. It's actually, in terms of size, larger than Egypt and Mesopotamia combined. It has a population of, at its peak, about 5 million people. Okay, so this is a huge area. What's really interesting is we have found no evidence of any organized warfare in this region during this time. The reason why is this region is connected through trade. Okay? So what we have found is 5 major urban centers in the Indus Valley Civilization. And these urban centers you can consider to be what we call value-adding processing centers. Okay, these are urban centers that specialize in taking raw goods like metals and agricultural products and turning them into finished products like jewelry, handicrafts, to be shipped, to be traded with mainly Mesopotamia, but also Egypt and possibly China as well. It also goes north to the Indus Valley Civilization, which then trades with the steppe people, the Andronov culture, okay? What we know as the Yamnaya people. All right? So this trade network, it's very, very complex. And everyone is involved in some capacity in this trade network. Okay? So that's the first thing that's interesting about the Indus Valley Civilization. They trade internally peacefully. They trade externally peacefully as well. We have absolutely no evidence that they ever had organized warfare. We have absolutely no evidence that they have any intention of organized warfare, meaning we have not found any weapons. We have found tools. We found hunting weapons. We have not found like maybe armor and helmets. Okay? Yeah?
Is there any particular reason that we can speculate that there is no organized warfare in that region?
Yeah, great question. So how do we know there's no organized warfare? So we know there's a lot of organized warfare in Mesopotamia and other places because of what we have dug up. So we look at cities, we see parts of the city that have been built on top of or destroyed, meaning there might have been some fires or there might have been some warfare. Okay, but with these 5 urban centers that we've dug up, we have found them pretty intact, meaning they were not built on top of or they were not destroyed when they were around. Okay, so that's the first major piece of evidence. The second major piece of evidence is we've dug up their graves. So if you look at maybe the civilizations of the Andronov culture or Mesopotamia, they tend to bury warriors with their weapons. Okay, so helmets and armor. But when we've dug up the IVC culture people, first of all, we don't find a distinct cast of warriors. Also, we don't find any helmets or armor or weapons. Okay, so that's what led us to believe they don't engage in organized warfare. But there's also evidence to suggest our evidence is not solid. Okay, the first piece of evidence is they don't bury their dead. These people don't have a tradition of burying their dead. Some are buried, okay, but not everyone is buried. Second of all, we don't know where they buried their dead. We assume they buried their dead in the cities, but that may not be true. Okay, so the evidence leans towards they were a peaceful civilization, but as we dig up more and more over time, we may discover this was not true. Okay, but right now the evidence suggests they were peaceful. And also, what's really important about the IVC, the Indus Valley Civilization, is this is a new discovery. We've only known about them for the past 100 years. So what's interesting is the Indians themselves never knew they existed. It was the British who discovered these cities and started the work in archaeology to start to reconstruct their civilization. Okay? All right. But thanks for the question. Okay. So as I said, the first thing that's interesting about their civilization is it was relatively peaceful, okay, compared with what's happening in Mesopotamia. The second thing that was interesting for us is, and surprising is, for a very large civilization, they are egalitarian, okay? Meaning, in Mesopotamia, when we look at these old cities, Ur and Uruk, there were these huge palaces and temples which suggested a concentration of power in the priesthood and in the king, okay? But when we look at these 5 urban centers of the IVC, there are no palaces, there are no temples, okay? In fact, these cities are extremely well designed. There are these walls around the city, and then as you go into the city, you're able to access every single part of the city. But if you were to go into a city, say in Sumer, if you go into the city, you're only able to access the temple or the palace. Okay, so authority is centralized in Sumer, whereas authority is sort of decentralized in the IVC. Now here's a question: if we suspect they are not engaged in warfare, why do they have walls? There are a lot of walls inside these cities. Why are there walls? Can anyone guess? Okay, customs, taxes, okay? Meaning this is, again, a value-adding processing center, and the way they survive economically is by collecting tolls and customs on people who trade. And the way they collect taxes is, when you enter the city, you have to go to the customs house, and then you pay whatever is required of you, and then you can access the city. Okay? And that's the way they centrally controlled the economy and trade in the IVC. These cities are amazing. These are the first people to invent the seat toilet, the private seat toilet. And this is about the year 2800 BCE, okay? So when you go into these cities, you'll find that in private homes, everyone has a private toilet. And then the feces is put into a sewage system, and the water flushes it out. Okay? That's pretty amazing. These are people who are very concerned about the well-being of all its citizens. So when we look at skeletal remains through DNA analysis, we've discovered the majority of the people ate about the same high quality of food. Okay? There wasn't these disparities between people as you would find in other civilizations. At least half the people, we think, live past the age of 55. That was an amazing achievement back then. In terms of innovation, they have reservoirs. Okay? They also have public baths. They also had really amazing things called wind towers. I'm not sure if you've studied these wind towers, but they're basically air conditioners. What they do is, these are high towers, and there's a hole on top, right? So what happens is the higher the air is, the cooler it is, right? So this wind that's cool gets trapped into the wind tower. It comes down and it pushes out the hot air from the other side. And this is what cools the houses in the summer. Okay, and this is a pretty advanced technology. Another really cool thing about the IVC is, even though it covers a huge area, they have standardized weights and measurements. Okay, they have standardized weights and measurements, which means that every brick that they have is the same size, which means that their buildings, their structures are extremely stable and resilient. And that's why 5,000 years later, we still have their cities intact. Okay? You can actually go to the cities and live in them. That's how stable the technology was. Okay? So this is a pretty advanced civilization. Unfortunately, we don't know what their writing system is. Okay? So if they had writing, and we can't know for sure if they had writing, it was like Chinese, an ideogrammic language, meaning it is not phonological. The spoken language is not the same as the written language. In other words, it is impossible for us to decipher their written language. We don't have that many artifacts of writing. We have seals with characters written on them, but we don't have anything else. And the reason could be, if you look at Egypt, they use papyrus. Okay, and papyrus is stable, or it keeps in the dry Egyptian air. Okay, if you look at Sumerian culture, Mesopotamian culture, they use cuneiform on clay tablets, which keeps forever. Okay, but if they had a writing system and they did write, it would be on palm leaves, which degrades very easily in the jungle air. Okay, so we don't have access to their writing. This is problematic because without access to their writing, we don't have access to their religion. We don't know what their religion is. And one thing that you've learned in this class that's very important is religion or mythology. It is the operating system of the culture. Okay? It is the collective consciousness, the collective worldview that gives life to their culture. It explains why they do what they do. And unfortunately, we don't know their religion. Okay? But, so, it's a complete mystery to archaeologists, to scholars, as to why this very advanced civilization was very peaceful and very egalitarian. We can only speculate. All right? Any questions so far before I continue? Okay, so I'm going to speculate as to why they were peaceful and egalitarian. So again, the key is the religion. What is their religion? Because that will give us clues as to their mentality, their value system, right? We know that the Mesopotamian people, their religion focused on struggle and achievement. We know that the Egyptians, their religion focused on the afterlife. Okay? This life that we live is, what's important is not the here and now. What's important is what happens afterwards. Okay? That's why the Egyptians built the pyramid. That's why they focus so much on funeral rites and on burial goods. All right? So there had to be a religion in the IVC that was different from the belief system in Sumer and Egypt that made it into a peaceful and egalitarian civilization. Okay? All right. So what is this religion and why were they different? My speculation is this. The key is to understand that this is a civilization based on trade. And they've been traders ever since they were born as a culture, meaning they were trading for at least 7,000, 8,000 years before they became a civilization. Okay? And if you're a trader, first of all, you're able to access the entire world. So we know for a fact they traded with Sumer and the Persian Gulf states because we have artifacts from the IVC in these places. Okay? We know for a fact. We can speculate it. They also traded with Egypt and with China just based on their technology and their trade networks. So this is a civilization based on trade. And as traders, they're able to see what's going on in Mesopotamia and Egypt. They know they built the pyramids in Egypt. They know there's massive warfare in Sumer. And I would think that if you were a trader and you saw these things, you wouldn't be impressed. Okay? In fact, you might be disgusted, especially by the warfare in Mesopotamia. This is the idea called the dialectic, right? And I think this is a very important idea for us to appreciate how history is often driven by the idea of the dialectic. So an example that we have in today's world is, you look at Japan and China, okay? These are two radically different societies that are next to each other. And the question then is, why are they still different? And I think the answer is because Japan knows China very well. And a lot of cultural practice Japan developed over the centuries have been in response to what they see as failings or successes in Chinese culture. Okay? Another example that Doug will appreciate is Canada and the United States. The United States is probably the most belligerent nation in the world. Okay? They cannot get their hands off anything. And then you go north, Canada, and Canada and the United States share the world's longest border. Basically, Canadians are cousins of the Americans, okay? I mean, there's really no difference. We speak the same language, we have the same cultural practices. But while Americans are the most belligerent nation ever in human history, Canadians invented peacekeeping, okay? The idea, nations should strive for mediation and peace, okay? And I think a lot of Canadian values, especially its political system, is in response to what it believes to be failings and successes in the American model. Okay? You also have New Zealand and Australia. So there are many different examples of the dialectic going on in our global political systems. And I believe that's what happened with the IVC, where these traders saw what's happening in Egypt and saw what's happening in Mesopotamia, and they were kind of disgusted, especially by all this warfare in Mesopotamia. Okay? Warfare back then was pretty awful. And so in Mesopotamia, the way they fight is they fight with these clay bullets. Okay? And you take a slingshot and you throw it at someone. And these things kill. They hurt. So think of David and Goliath, okay? And if you're a trader, you'll see this warfare going on. You'll see people being beheaded. And why are they doing this? They're doing it in the name of God, okay? Every city-state has a patron god that it believes it must defend and honor and protect. And whenever there's a dispute, it's because they feel their god has been dishonored by another city-state. So they go to war and they kill each other. Okay? And again, if you're a trader and you see this, you don't think this is a good thing. And you go to Egypt and you see these pyramids, and these pyramids are, again, extremely impressive. But at the same time, you also see the consequences of these pyramids, which is just massive inequality, massive corruption, just massive waste. All right? So I think that by trading with these two civilizations and other civilizations, it reinforces the deep cultural values of the IVC people, and it basically compels them towards peace and egalitarianism. Okay? That's what I believe happened. All right? Now, there are other arguments. For example, maybe these people are just genetically peaceful and egalitarian. But I've made the argument in this class that from the onset of early human history, we were peaceful and egalitarian people, but different geographic circumstances changed our outlook. Okay, so for example, the people in the steppes, who we call the Yamaya people, because of the grasslands, because it is such a poor and rugged and unforgiving environment, they're forced to be cattle ranchers. They're forced to engage in cattle raiding. Okay? And over time, their culture became very aggressive, expansionist, and opportunistic. Opportunistic just means they'll do whatever it needs to survive. If they face they'll trade with people if that's what benefits them. They'll kill people if that's what benefits them. They are not that moral. Okay, they're very opportunistic. And I remember, as I said, these people with their cultural values would go in and conquer all of Europe in about 200, 300 years. Okay, and they were called the Yamnaya people. Back in the steppes, these Yamnaya people continue to evolve over time, and over time, they became even more aggressive, more expansionist, and more opportunistic. Okay, eventually, the Mongols, Genghis Khan and Mongols, will come from this civilization. Okay, so that's my argument to you. And again, it's my speculation. It is because of their interaction with other cultures that convinced them to pursue a peaceful and egalitarian lifestyle. Now, there are still inequalities in IBC. We know there are classes. We know there's wealth inequality. But relative to Mesopotamia and Egypt, it was a relatively peaceful and egalitarian society.